Thank you, Verdes. I'm very happy to be here. I was here a couple of years ago speaking on something similar. I've actually been working on this topic, that is ethical issues related to whales and dolphins, now for about 20 years. 20 years ago, not many people were curious. Every now and then people say, oh, you were ahead of your time. But trust me, that's no compliment. It's really lonely to be ahead of your time. I'd much rather be now where people are saying, oh, this is interesting and very current. This is the first time I've done this talk. So the invitation came at a perfect time. I'm doing some talks later this year, and so you get to be my guinea pigs on what I'm trying to do as a somewhat different way of talking about ethical issues related to whales and dolphins, as a way of building a bridge between the scientific community and ethicists like myself in trying to find a practical, clear, succinct way of talking about the issues that Roberta was referring to, this issue of rights, the issues of captivity and the like, which now there really is a good deal of attention on. I'm going to try to go for about 30 minutes so that it doesn't put too many people to sleep too quickly. And then I'm happy to stay as long as you want for Q&A. The topic that we're talking about has been getting a good deal of attention in the last few years. Of course, there's the documentary Blackfish. You may have heard about, I assume, living in California, you did, that there's a bill making its way through the legislature. It'll come back in another year that would ban orcas using in shows in California. Just earlier this week, in an issue of Science, which is put out by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, there was a column that talked about the fact that the National Aquarium is now dialing back its use of captive dolphins. They no longer do shows. Not surprisingly, we have had another side advance, another set of arguments. SeaWorld has, in its advertisements and in some full-page ads, been expressing their opinion. What we have seen, unfortunately, and particularly the last couple of times this topic has been talked about in scientific sessions, is there's a lot of disagreement, there's a lot of controversy, there's more confusion, there's more darkness than light, as it were. And my goal is, through this talk and through the current writing that I'm doing, trying at the very least to bring some clarity to the discussion. So the primary goal of what I want to do tonight is to address that if we're going to talk about issues of rights, if we're going to talk about ethics relating to whales and dolphins, if we're going to talk about whether or not captivity, sonar testing, all kinds of fishing practices are ethically acceptable or not in relation to whales and dolphins, how do we talk about that in a way that we just don't end up shouting at one another and be frustrated? Because the methodology of science is one that's supposed to ultimately get us answers, not just leave us wanting to pick up 2x4s against one another. The way I propose to go at this is we're going to start off by talking about ethics in general. And these are the main concepts that I want to walk you through. What it means to say that a being has moral standing, what kind of standard we might use then in making some judgment about the ethical acceptability or not of actions. The concept of flourishing. This is going to be, in my opinion, the central concept in how we talk about particularly issues of captivity, but also issues of treatment of whales and dolphins in the wild, and I'll obviously get to that. And then ultimately what all of this says about the claim about rights for whales and dolphins. We're going to do this by focusing more attention at the outset on what all of this means as far as humans go. We're all humans, we should be able to relate to that pretty easily, and then make the transition to say how much of this can we apply to whales and dolphins. Okay, ethics. I've been teaching ethics for more decades than I'm willing to admit publicly. It is a topic that gets tremendous confusion and disagreement, and while there is, even among philosophers and specialists, considerable disagreement, in the end, it's a really very simple enterprise. It's about evaluating actions. That's all that ethics is. However, I mean, very complicated theory. People come at it from very different ways, but the basic idea is that it's about evaluating whether an action is positive or negative in a particular way. Now, the first thing is, if you're going to talk about an ethical issue, you get to say, okay, who counts? Here, for example, we have 2 chess players. One apparently is cheating. So you might say, well, okay, we have an ethical issue here. Whose interest counts? Well, the 2 players. Well, what about the chess piece that's being eaten? We'd probably say, probably not. The chess piece doesn't count in this way. Why is that? Why does the chess piece not have moral standing? Get count in the calculation? Well, the chess piece is not vulnerable to pain and suffering. The simplest way, and what I'm giving is a very simple, overly simplified explanation of all of this. But the simplest way to talk about who counts, who has moral standing, is you have to be vulnerable to pain and suffering in some fashion. Now, among humans, in an ethical issue, yeah, we all count. We all count as individuals. Why is that? Because the kind of vulnerability that we have to pain and suffering is really because of the nature of the brains that we have. We have very sophisticated brains. We have a very sophisticated nervous system that makes us vulnerable to physical pain. It makes us vulnerable also to emotional pain. It makes us, because of the way that our brains let us think about the future and remember the past, we also can be subject to pain from memory and from apprehension about the future, grief and dread. We have a wide range of suffering and pain that we can experience because of just how sophisticated our brains are. As humans, we go around saying we're the smartest beings on the planet. Other beings would probably disagree with that, but we say it anyway. And we say we have these brains that let us do remarkable things. And our brains do let us do remarkable things. But it's a two-edged sword. We get to think, we get to plan, we get to build, we get to form deep relationships. The flip side is we're exposed to the capacity of pain and suffering, grief, doubt, and the like. So that's why in a human situation, as far as ethical issues go, everybody counts. Everybody counts as individuals, not just as a group. Okay, if we have an ethical issue, the 2 chess players, both of them count. When we want to evaluate the ethical character of an action, we need a standard. Among philosophers, of course, there's relatively little that we agree on. That's what we're paid to do, to disagree. However, generally speaking, in ethics, there are at least 2 principles that virtually every tradition agrees on. That is, do no harm and treat others appropriately. And no matter what ethical tradition you look at, basically agreement on these 2 ideas. Now, you maybe have disagreement about how they get applied, but you can think of it, that ethics is about applying a standard or a ruler that has 2 sides. One side evaluates tangible harm, another intangible. Now, when I make that distinction, again, this is important to keep in mind because of what comes from the kinds of brains that we have. We are subject to pain, suffering, physical pain, suffering, illness, disease, and all of that because of the physical character of who we are. But this second principle, treat others appropriately, when I say it's intangible, generally speaking, we would say it is possible to treat another person unethically, even if they don't know it. For example, if we read someone else's mail, if we invade their privacy, if we spy on them and they don't know it, we can say, wait a minute, nobody's being hurt there. But most of us would say, no, wait a minute, there's something about what we're entitled to that even something like this can count as a kind of harm. Now, if I spy on my cat, I do not think that I'm acting in any way ethically ethically inappropriately because he doesn't really care. His brain is somewhat, now he runs the house, but that's a different matter, and I've made my peace with that. But he doesn't seem to care about, if we keep an eye on him. Humans are different. Again, this is something to do about the nature of the character of the experience that we have, not just external, but internal experience. So, the fact that we have moral standing as individuals with a sophisticated capacity takes us into a couple of general principles in ethics that lets us say, okay, this is now when we have a situation we need to make a judgment about, we have to apply both of these. Of course, the next question is, if we accept those principles, what counts as harm and what counts as inappropriate treatment? Who decides? For the purposes of this perspective that I'm trying to encourage you to consider, the central concept I'm going to suggest is the concept of flourishing. Now, this is a passage from the philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who's at the University of Chicago, has written a very important book on ethics as it relates to non-humans, and she writes, "Each creature has a characteristic set of capabilities or capacities for functioning distinctive of that species, and that those more rudimentary capacities need support from the material and social environment if the animal is to flourish in its characteristic way." Now, a somewhat different way of putting that is that when we say we're talking about flourishing, we're talking about full, healthy growth and development of the traits, skills, and dispositions that allow a being to have a satisfying and successful life as a member of that species. The reason that this is so important is that when we think about the complexity of the human person, for example, and we ask the question, what does it take to have a successful, satisfying life as a human being? What it means is that we need to be able to develop those intrinsic traits and capacities and skills that we have. And we have to be able to do that in the context of the community and society in which we live. We just don't get born, have all those abilities, and can master the environment in which we live. We have to be able to grow and develop. Flourishing, as I suggested, I'm convinced, is the most important concept when we now talk particularly about non-humans and ethical issues, and obviously, for tonight, the issue of whales and dolphins. So keep this in mind, because we're going to keep going back to this, that we have this direct line between ethics, standards, do no harm, treat others appropriately. We're going to evaluate that by the conditions that a being has to enjoy in order to flourish. Okay, let's talk about humans. What are the conditions that we need in order to have a full, developed, and successful life? Okay, we need to have physical and emotional health and safety. We need to have a life absent of pain and suffering. We need protection when we're young and infirm. We need freedom of choice. We need equality. We need justice and the like. We need appropriate respect for our dignity as autonomous individuals. We aren't just one of a group. We're all unique. We have an opportunity, we need to have an opportunity to learn the necessary skills that let us navigate the waters of life. We need access to meaningful emotional relationships because we're so social, and we need rest. Now this is I offer as a rough and a general explanation list of what kinds of things we need. But I think it's kind of common sense that if we want to identify the conditions necessary for an ordinary human being to grow and develop, to end up feeling that you have power in your life and to have a satisfying life, these are the kinds of things that we would need. The direct connection to ethics is I'm suggesting that this notion of flourishing and the necessary conditions for flourishing give us a way of talking about, at least in one way, what counts as wrong. Okay, so imagine a life where you don't have physical and emotional health and safety. Imagine an action that prevents that. At least, all things being equal, I'm sure most of us would say, no, that's going to get in the way of feeling that life is okay. Pain and suffering, again, yeah, that's not going to help. If we don't get protection when we're young or when we're sick, very difficult to have a sense that life is satisfying, that we can be successful. Now we can work around a lot of these things, but that's not necessarily what we would say are the ideal conditions. Freedom, equality, justice, and the like. Now again, human beings are remarkably capable of adapting to bad situations. We can tolerate things like that. But when we tolerate the absence of freedom, when we tolerate the absence of equality, we don't say, oh, it doesn't matter. For me, one of the most striking examples of just how important intangible needs are, intangible conditions. Think of how many times human beings have risked their lives for intangible ideas. Freedom, individuality, justice, fairness, and it's part of our DNA, it's part of how we're hardwired. Appropriate respect for our dignity as autonomous individuals. Treating one another as property, treating one another as objects, does not go down well with us, giving us a sense that, yes, we can flourish and we can grow and develop. Deprive someone of the skills necessary to navigate their community, to read, to write, impossible to have a sense that you're growing and developing. It's stunting. You are not able to be nourished, you are not able to flourish given the nature of your species. Similarly, we are extraordinarily social beings, as are some other folk on the planet. We don't just, while there are folk who are hermits, most of us don't simply want, we need emotional relationships. We also cannot work all the time. We do need rest. A life of drudgery would not be satisfying. What I'm suggesting then, this again is that direct link between this notion of flourishing and ethics, is that if we focus on setting aside any sort of ethereal theories about ethics or anything, we take a very common sense attitude. What are the conditions that human beings need in order to have a sense that we are growing, we are developing, we can have some level of mastery of our own lives, we can have a sense of well-being and success. This is really all that we're talking about. Ethics then becomes a fairly simple matter of what's the relationship between these actions that we're looking at and the conditions that we need in order to flourish. Now, very important question. If we say, let's say for the sake of argument, everybody says, okay, that seems to make sense. Human beings need these kinds of things. Where does this come from? Well, very important to keep in mind, it comes from evolution and adaptation. We are as we are as a result of millions of years of adapting to an environment, natural selection, adaptation, which gets us to the kinds of beings we are with all those internal and external rewards and punishments. And so it's that process that gets us up to the modern character of who we are, externally and internally. It's all of that which has us become beings who pair bond, raise children in families, live in communities. In short, it's not an accident. The conditions that we need in order to flourish as modern humans is the result of millions of years of a process of how we lived and developed and mastered a particular environment. Land, for example, with our big brains. Let's shift gears and talk about rights, because this becomes a very big deal in the discussion about whales and dolphins. It's very important to keep in mind the difference between legal rights and moral rights. All the talk, from my perspective, the most important discussion about rights as it relates to whales and dolphins is moral rights. Legal rights is what a legislature decides. Legal rights can be given to anything. A legislature could make my toaster a person with the same rights that you and I have. Legislatures make corporations persons. Legal rights really, they're very important, but there's no guarantee that what in this discussion that we're having about ethics and whales and dolphins, we aren't necessarily talking about legal rights, although at some point that would be nice. We are talking about moral rights. But all that means, again, is we're back to flourishing. When I say that we have a moral right to something, really that's a shorthand way of saying that we're entitled to something because we need it in order to flourish. It's the sense of it's a basic need, it's a basic condition that we have. Again, I'm trying to make ethics simple and practical, and that at least we can identify some areas where most of us would agree. That, in a common sense way, that it works. So that, in that way, to say that humans have basic human rights, not necessarily legal rights, but human rights, that you see in, for example, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, or other of the many declarations of lists of human rights, it's really to say we have a right to it because it's a condition that we really need in order to grow and develop into a healthy, strong individual. So, ethics and humans, the short version, I say we have moral standing as individuals because we have vulnerability to harm. We have these big brains, we have these sophisticated capacities. Harm and inappropriate treatment, really, when we say that, we're really just talking about anything that would deny the conditions that we need for flourishing. And again, moral rights, again, a shorthand way of saying, yeah, we're referring to those conditions. That's why harm or inappropriate treatment from an ethical standpoint become negative, because these are the things that we need for this. Shifting gears, I'm going to show you how I think the same way of looking at things applies to cetaceans. First question, do whales and dolphins have moral standing in an ethical calculation? I would say yes, because they have a similar kind of vulnerability to harm because of their big brains. Laurie Marino, who is the world's expert on the dolphin brain, explains this in great detail, but when she describes the dolphin brain, the argument is that at the very least it's the second most impressive bit of hardware of this sort on the planet. And it has capacity for physical pain, it has capacity for emotional pain. One of the most important things that brain does, that it does for us, is to allow for recognition, a sense of self. What's called the mirror self-recognition research, which is you look into a mirror, do you recognize it as your reflection or just an image of something else? This is a very sophisticated brain function in human babies. It's what, I think 12, 18 months where you see this come along. Dolphins, elephants, chimps, maybe one other non-human are the only ones able to do that. This is not only important, this bit of research is, in my opinion, the most unappreciated bit of scientific research on dolphins. Because if you spend your life, as philosophers do, brooding about the nature of consciousness, the capacity to have a sense of self means that you have a qualitatively different individual experience than if you don't. It means that you don't just experience the world. You can reflect on the world. You can reflect on the contents of your consciousness. You can develop ideas. You can develop plans. It's like you have a workbench in your head that you can manipulate all kinds of invisible things. You can imagine, you can recall, you can project. You have a dramatically richer experience, which, as I suggested before, comes at a cost. For all the good stuff, there's the vulnerability to pain and suffering. And so I'd say that you get the same issue. Given all of that, then what does that say about what whales and dolphins would need to flourish? Well, they need, and now we look in the wild. We say, okay, what's their life like in the wild? They raise children. They travel over great distances. They, depending upon where they live, have to learn how to feed, and they can have to devise very different strategies. solve all kinds of problems. They have to learn how to live with one another. Frankly, in my opinion, the ability to learn to play well with the other boys and girls is more important in the ocean than it is on land, because your life in the ocean, you cannot build walls, you cannot build buildings. Your life depends upon how well you work with your community. Your friend or your enemy, your colleague, your conspecific is your best bet for safety. So you better learn how to play nice with them and not kill them, which I think is one of the reasons that dolphin aggression is restrained. Dolphins also need to figure out how to work with a sense that we don't have, echolocation. That's a very important capacity in a world which is largely dark, which the ocean is, about how to succeed. And again, you have to learn how to manage aggression in a way that lets you grow and develop. If we take the same idea that we did with humans, that there's a connection between them identifying the necessary conditions for flourishing and ethics, same idea that I suggested before. That is, if we're going to talk about what counts as rights, well, that's just a way of talking about, again, a shorthand way of talking about the conditions that are necessary for a being of that sort in that environment to grow, develop, get to the point where they're able to have a successful and satisfying life. So this is what they then need. This is what we would say they then have a right to. And again, it's a moral right, which is simply to say, given the nature of the being, the nature of the species, this is what they have evolved to need. Keeping in mind, by the way, that not only have they evolved over this, they've evolved over a much longer period of time than we have. The ancestor of contemporary whales and dolphins started this way on land about 55, 60 million years ago. About 45 million, they're looking like this. 20 million like this. This is the present. We are talking about, with humans, 3 to 4 million years. With whales and dolphins, 50 to 60 million years. But current dolphin out in the bay here, we're talking about a being that has been operating within that environment and developing strategies for success about how to cope with that environment and become fashioned then to need these kinds of things in order to do that. This is a dramatically different time span than we're talking about with us. Now, I don't think anyone could say exactly what all the significance of that is, but that's not a fact that should be easily overlooked, because it really must have some kind of significance in the speaking to the what counts as harm when you deprive a being designed that way of those conditions. Sticking within this notion of rights, while this has been more in the news recently because of the controversies. A few years ago, a number of us got together in Helsinki and were asked to draw up a declaration of rights for cetaceans. And notice what we came up with, again, even though we weren't talking about it in the same way, was based on the question, what would a being like this need to have a successful and satisfying life? If you go and you look at the Declaration of Rights for Cetaceans, these are some of the main claims. That every individual cetacean obviously has a right to life. You would need life to succeed. That no cetacean should be held in captivity or servitude or be subject to cruel treatment or be removed from their natural environment. The idea was that you're talking about a being that has evolved and developed in the ocean, travels a great deal of distance typically each day, and has this autonomous sense of self, which we respect in our species, and we argue that it should be respected in others as well. All cetaceans have the right to freedom of movement. And these are not folk who sit in one place, they move around, and residence within their natural environment. A natural environment is what they have learned to master, to learn to adapt in the same way that we have learned to master and adapt to land. that no sedation should be regarded as property. And this has to do with a similar attitude that we have towards humans. We have said, humans, there is something about us that is unique, that is valuable in and of itself, that to treat one another as an object, to treat one another as something that we can buy and sell, even if we treat one another very well after we've bought one another, that just is not acceptable. This, again, goes back to, and this would take a longer discussion about the nature of the brain and internal experience, but the idea that when you find beings who have that same kind of sense of self and uniqueness, this is the kind of respect that they're entitled to. Rights to protection of their natural environment, obviously that would count as harm when you disrupt someone's safe environment, as might go on with, for example, some of the sonar testing. And here, also, cetaceans have the right not to be subject to disruptions of their cultures. Whales and dolphins, it has been discovered, have cultures, not simply rich socialized. They have cultures that are passed on from generation to generation and that can be disrupted by human activity. So, parallel thing with ethics, whales and dolphins is, I would argue, like humans, they have moral standing as individuals because of their vulnerability to harm. Again, this has to do with the nature of the brain and the kind of experience, internal experience it allows for. Harm and inappropriate treatment have to do with being denied those conditions needed for flourishing. Now, I want to underscore, flourishing as it relates to the species we're talking about. Flourishing, the conditions that we need and the conditions that they need are different. Conditions we need come from our evolutionary history. The conditions they need come from their evolutionary history. So when we talk about rights, we aren't talking about the same thing. Roberta raised it terrifically well when she said, is that we're talking about human rights? Well, no, we're talking about cetacean rights because of the nature of the cloth from which they're cut, the same way we ground human rights in the cloth from which we're cut. And so, moral rights, again, shorthand for talking about the conditions needed for flourishing. So as you see, what I'm suggesting is we can take the same general language, we can take the same major terms, moral standing, ethical standards, flourishing, conditions necessary for growth and development, rights. We can take those same terms, apply them appropriately to the differences between the species, but still give us a common vocabulary that lets us then look at the facts to determine whether or not the current debatable practices are defensible or not. So the big questions that we end up with then, can whales and dolphins flourish in captivity? Are they harmed? Are they treated inappropriately? And that is what those of us who are currently involved in the world of marine mammal science are debating. The goal of this talk and the goal of the current work that I'm doing is to say that there are ways of talking about this that, as I said at the outset, we do not end up simply griping at one another, grumbling, fighting about, because these become factual issues. These get settled by scientific facts about everything from the dolphin brain to the nature and range of dolphin social behavior in the wild and the kind of activity that they then have or do not have in captive situations. By extension, of course, if we then go to issues such as drive hunts, the attempts to bring back commercial whaling, other fishing practices in which whales and dolphins and other cetaceans are harmed, military testing, military use of dolphins, this then becomes the from this ethical perspective, this becomes the primary question. Can whales and dolphins flourish in those conditions? From this ethical perspective, to say no they can't would be to say, well, then it's not ethically acceptable. On the other hand, if the answer is yes they can, then there is a way to say that these practices are ethically acceptable, or at least can be adapted to become so. Thank you very much.
only confined to whales and dolphins. What about all the other species that are?
That's a terrific question. The reason is that this is the only non-human species I know anything about. No, I'm serious. This perspective can work with other non-humans. I'm affiliated with the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics, and I know people who do large theories about animal ethics. I'm not one of those people because I came into this thinking that, given my limitations, I needed to fashion my arguments around a relatively limited and identifiable body of scientific data, and that I could then participate in scientific fieldwork related to dolphins. I'm comfortable talking about these species. The only reason I don't talk about others is that I don't know enough about that. Now, I have been reading some interesting things recently, for example, about elephants, in which I'd say, from everything that seems to be the case, exactly the same argument can be applied to elephants. Probably the same argument can be applied to most non-human animals in zoos, but there is a difference between those who have a sense of self and those that don't. Now, that does not mean to say that does not mean that those who don't, you can treat any way you want. It just means that there's a difference in how we would evaluate pain and suffering.
How do you determine whether they have a feeling of self?
The best research these days is mirror self-recognition. Now, that is one way that we are able to determine that a being has a sense of self because it recognizes its reflection not as another whale or dolphin, but as itself. At the same time, we have to be really clear about the fact that this is a human-devised test based on vision. Vision is our primary sense. Whales and dolphins, sound is. So, and now you then start talking about other non-humans. You say, okay, how do you figure out what would be an appropriate test about whether some other non-human, for example, bats, wouldn't use vision. Elephants have used mirror self-recognition, but this then now becomes one of the big challenges when we now shift and say, well, maybe we aren't the only beings on the planet who have these capacities. So the big challenge is, okay, what tools do we use in order to find this out? Because I think anyone who does any reading in this, you can't help but be surprised at how much really fascinating stuff is going on out there. Crows who solve problems. African gray parrots who are better at language than dolphins and the like. So there's far more that we do not know. Yes, sir.
What is your opinion on like the documentary Blackfish and how its impact on SeaWorld, and due to the fact that half the staff of SeaWorld is
I think that, first of all, the documentary did bring attention to a very important issue which had been gathering momentum. It has sparked a great deal of interest in a kind of issue in a way that many people who would have overlooked it would not have been paying enough attention. From my perspective, one of the most important things that it should lead to is that when you combine that with the science and all of the other signs of momentum that are going on, it becomes apparent that over the long term, SeaWorld is not, in my opinion, a viable model for profitability. The demographics are such, I don't think it can work in the short term, but I think that when you put all of the things you're talking about, that people, even as employees, perceive, that it suggests that even as a business, it's now on shaky ground.